Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Center for American Progress. Thank you for coming out this morning. We will be getting started in just a couple of minutes. Two brief reminders before we begin. First, please silence all cell phones and other electronic devices. Second, there will be a question and answer period following the panel discussion. We ask that you wait for the microphone to come to you, state your name and affiliation before your question. Thank you.
Good morning. Welcome to the Center for American Progress. My name is Carmel Martin, and I'm the Executive Vice President for Policy here at CAP. And I'm thrilled that you could join us to discuss the importance of entrepreneurship for all, where all people have the opportunity to turn their ideas into their careers. Small business is the backbone of the American economy. For many Americans, being able to start a business is a critical step on the career ladder and an economic boost for their communities. But entrepreneurship has been on the decline since the 1990s, and women and people of color continue to be greatly underrepresented among our entrepreneurs. These entrepreneurs still have trouble getting the capital and learning the skills they need to be successful. Low and moderate income communities face an even greater disadvantage in accessing financial services, entrepreneurial education, and business networks. With rising economic inequality and a struggling middle class, we need progressive policies that level the playing field for the entrepreneurs of all races, gender, and income level. This won't just benefit entrepreneurs, it will help us build a more innovative and dynamic economy, because we know increasing these opportunities helps families grow their assets and boosts local economies. Today, CAP's economic policy team is releasing our new report, A Progressive Agenda for Inclusive and Diverse Entrepreneurship, where we examine the leading causes of lower rates of business ownership among women and people of color, and what policies can help these groups overcome structural barriers in starting a business. Among our many proposals, we call for reauthorizing the State Small Business Credit Initiative to give states flexible tools and resources to encourage their unique small business economies. We also call for programs that help future entrepreneurs develop skills, knowledge, and networks through early entrepreneurial education, business ownership apprenticeships, self-employment assistance programs, and expanding municipal business services. These proposals are designed to make entrepreneurship more inclusive, diverse, and accessible to every American community. To kick off this morning's discussion, we are honored to welcome U.S. Treasury Secretary Jack Lew. Secretary Lew is a longtime public servant. He was the director of the Office of Management and Budget under President Clinton from 1998 to 2001, and again under President Obama from 2010 to 2012, before serving as White House Chief of Staff at the beginning of the president's second term. For the past 3 years, he has led the Treasury Department's efforts to expand capital to underserved communities, reaffirming its commitment to supporting small business owners through its State Small Business Credit Initiative, Small Business Lending Fund, and Community Development Financial Institutions Fund. Secretary Lew's leadership was especially integral during the recovery to help establish the nascent State Small Business Credit Initiative and Small Business Lending Fund programs. Today's discussion reflects the importance of Treasury's work on these issues and the success of Secretary Lew's leadership. Please join me in welcoming the Secretary of the Treasury, Jack Lew.
Thanks so much, Carmel, and thanks to all of you for being here. It's a pleasure to be here today to discuss a topic that's so vitally important to our nation's economic progress, expanding opportunities and creating a more sustainable path forward for America's entrepreneurs and small business owners. Let me begin by thanking the Center for American Progress for hosting us today and for their continued leadership advancing this critically important work. And Carmel, Martin, thank you both for your work and for the warm introduction. It's good to see you again. Today's event provides an opportunity to examine 3 important reports. 2 are being released by the Treasury Department and focus on the tremendous impact of the Small Business Lending Fund and the State Small Business Credit Initiative. Both of these programs have helped entrepreneurs and small business owners access capital in the wake of the Great Recession. Additionally, new research that CAP is releasing today details why these resources continue to be so critically important. Our gathering also marks just over 6 years since the passage of the Small Business Jobs Act that created SBLF and SSBCI. We're extraordinarily proud of these programs and the impact that they've made and continue to make. This morning, I'm here to share a bit more about the success of both SBLF and SSBCI as these programs near their conclusion. For policymakers and small business advocates, these unique programs offer a number of important lessons. 6 years ago, passage of the Small Business Jobs Act and other important steps taken by the President and policymakers led our nation out of the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, helping us regain our economic footing and putting us on a stronger, more sustainable path forward. The passage of the Small Business Jobs Act in particular reflected the need to address the sharp decline in small business lending in the wake of the financial crisis. Looking at the U.S. economy as a whole, businesses have created 15.3 million jobs. GDP is now more than 10.5% larger than its previous peak, and millions of mortgage holders are back above water. We continue to make an historic economic turnaround, and entrepreneurs and small businesses have been a critical driver of this progress. Building on this success and ensuring that our economy is working for all of its citizens must also involve efforts to level the playing field for American entrepreneurs and small business owners. Such efforts should include increasing access to capital, which is essential to the success of any small business, allowing entrepreneurs to invest in and grow their businesses. Even for many high-qualified candidates, securing capital can be an uphill climb. For others, it is simply out of reach. America's small businesses are the lifeblood of our economy. They create jobs, drive innovation, and produce the kind of inclusive, sustainable growth that's so important to our nation's economic future. But without capital, no matter how hard you are willing to work or how detailed your entrepreneurial vision may be, you cannot put your plan into action. That's why the administration has moved so aggressively to ease the flow of credit. The Small Business Lending Fund, or SBLF, is a pillar of these efforts, continuing to help create jobs and promote economic growth in communities across the United States. The SBLF program encouraged small business lending by providing capital to Main Street banks and community development loan funds. Since the program's inception in 2010, SBLF has helped to increase small business lending by a remarkable $18.7 billion, giving a lift to more than 3,000 communities in 47 states and the District of Columbia. Importantly, SBLF's inclusive approach has created opportunities for all citizens, regardless of geography or the scope of the idea being supported. SBLF investments have supported an estimated 76,000 in qualified small business loans, with nearly 80% in amounts of $250,000 or less, benefiting a wide array of businesses across many different industries throughout the life of the program. Many here today have been important partners of Treasury's State Small Business Credit Initiative, or SSBCI. As you know, SSBCI provides critical funds to state lending and investment programs. The initiative has a unique ability to drive innovation created through states working with private lenders to design programs specific to the small business needs of their communities. With a relatively small investment, SSBCI has been able to leverage greater levels of private sector loans and investments and direct them to our nation's small businesses. In total, the program has supported $8.4 billion in new small business lending or investing through almost 17,000 transactions, 42% of which were to businesses in low and moderate income communities. SSBCI has helped to connect precious resources to more than 16,000 small businesses across a range of industries, from retail, trade, and manufacturing to accommodations and food services. Among the program's many success stories is that of George Constantinou and Farid Ali Lacheros, who own a Latin bistro in Park Slope, Brooklyn. In 2013, they were in a position to expand, and an SSBCI loan helped them do just that. Today, their bistro has created more than 70 community jobs, provides its employees with health insurance and 401k plans, and continues to serve Bogota-inspired cuisine in Brooklyn. George and Farid provide a powerful example of the inclusive, long-term economic benefits of small business success. While SBLF and SSBCI were born out of unique circumstances, their creative structures and the execution offer lessons for future policymakers. Through an innovative SBLF dividend structure on invested capital, the rate paid by each bank on Treasury's investment was inversely tied to the level of small business lending that an institution provided to its community. Again, this innovative approach allowed the program to take $4 billion in public investment and leverage it into $18.7 billion of private sector credit in communities across the United States, and at no net cost to the taxpayer. And understanding that 3/4 of private venture capital in the United States is typically directed to just 3 markets, San Francisco, New York, and Boston, SSBCI investment funds took a more inclusive approach, supporting investments in businesses and communities throughout the nation. In all, SSBCI provided more than $450 million in venture investment funds across 38 states. Both the SBLF and SSBCI demonstrate that the public and private sectors work best when they're working together. I was encouraged to see that the report released by the Center for American Progress today calls for the reauthorization and even expansion of SSBCI, which is set to expire in 2017. If Congress does not reauthorize the program, it will be a missed opportunity to build upon the progress SSBCI has made to date. It will also severely curtail the more than 140 active state small business financing programs around the country that were established or expanded through SSBCI funding to help Main Street entrepreneurs start and scale their businesses and help local economies grow. The report CAP released today also notes that lower rates of entrepreneurship among minority communities and women are largely a result of a long-standing and persistent wealth gap. All too often, communities of color, women, and low-income families face stark challenges accessing credit. In particular, individuals in these communities often have a harder time securing business investment and financing and incur higher borrowing costs to start a business. Everyone deserves a chance to succeed in this economy. Moreover, we all succeed when everyone is included and actively contributing. But as the CAP report highlights, even in 2016, many Americans, especially in low-income and minority families, remain virtually locked out of the financial system and lack access to safe and affordable financial products and services. Without a banking or credit history, it can be difficult, if not impossible, to qualify for the most basic home mortgage or small business loan. If you're cut off from the formal financial system, it's almost impossible to build the savings and investments that are essential for a secure financial future. And without a financial education, many do not even understand the tools they need to build this future. At Treasury, we've taken a number of efforts to help more Americans participate safely in the financial system and build a credit history that can assist them in taking advantage of economic opportunities, such as starting or growing a small business. Through resources provided by SSBCI, SBLF, and the CDFI Fund, Treasury has helped entrepreneurs access capital so that low-income areas can continue to benefit from the economic development that results from the success of small businesses. Indeed, in authorizing and implementing the Small Business Jobs Act, Congress and Treasury recognized the need to assist these communities by requiring SBLF participants to engage in outreach to minorities, women, and veterans. We've produced a report on the impact of SBLF on minority, women, and veteran-owned businesses. And we've required states applying for SSBCI funding to deliver a plan for how to support low and moderate income, minority, and other underserved communities. These efforts yield tangible and important results. As CAP's research attests, those who own businesses are doing comparatively better than non-business owning households. African American business owners earn more than $53,000 on average compared to just over $7,000 for non-business owners. The contrast is equally notable for Hispanic business owning households, with more than $41,000 in total wealth on average compared to $16,000 for non-business owners. As we look ahead beyond the next 3 months, I would encourage all of you to continue to work with and challenge the next administration in the same way you've pressed us to respond to our nation's most difficult issues. We continue to support the reauthorization of SSBCI with an additional $1.5 billion in funding as outlined in the President's budget. We're also encouraged that certain members of Congress already have introduced bills to extend the program, and we're hopeful that they will consider keeping SSBCI going in the near future. Thank you again for all that you continue to bring to this work. I look forward to a day when anyone with an entrepreneurial spirit and the willingness to work hard have the opportunity to make their dream a reality. And this conference is an important step for making sure people have the tools they need to accomplish that dream. Thank you.
Thank you to Secretary for your remarks, and thank you for all the panelists coming. I'm really excited about this panel today. So I'm going to introduce you all, and then I'm going to open it up and give each of you a question to try to get the discussion started. So Professor Aaron Chatterjee is an associate professor at Duke University's Fuqua School of Business. He previously served as a senior economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors, where he worked on a lot of the issues that we're talking about today, including entrepreneurship, innovation, infrastructure, and economic growth. His research and teaching now are focusing on entrepreneurship, innovation, and expanding the social mission of business. And he was awarded an inaugural junior faculty fellowship from the Coffin Foundation to recognize his work as a leading scholar in entrepreneurship. He also served as a fellow at the Center for American Progress way back in the early days, it was 2006, 2007. So
ancient history.
Yeah, so it's great to have him back here. And Luana Russell, directly to his left, is the founder and president of Business Management Associates, a business process and human capital management firm with more than 90 employees. Russell possesses more than 20 years of experience in all aspects of business operations and government contracting, serving federal and state governments and international entities. Russell founded BMA to continue to the people and the process and integration work she began as a consultant. She developed the business from the ground up, establishing technical and operational infrastructure and establishing the employee and client-focused culture. And she's also a board member of the Small Business Majority, where she's working with Small Business Majority on their platforms for both women entrepreneurs and for minority entrepreneurs. And Jessica Milano is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Small Business, Community Development, and Housing at the U.S. Department of Treasury, where she manages a portfolio of policy issues, including small business, access to capital, affordable housing finance, and community economic development. In addition, her office oversees the State Small Business Credit Initiative and the Small Business Lending Fund and the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund that the Secretary remarked on. Milano has also served as a senior advisor to the administrator at the Small Business Administration and has economic consulting and financial services experience. And finally, Amy Sanchez serves as the general counsel on the Senate's Committee on Small Business and Entrepreneurship. In her current role, Sanchez handles a number of legislative issues, including small business healthcare issues, entrepreneurial development, technical assistance, and assistance for small business owners. Previously, she served as an associate counsel at the National Campaign for Fair Elections and assistant director for the lawyer chapters of the American Constitutional Society. Sanchez has her JD from Texas A&M University. So I want to start out by opening it up to something that the Secretary said about Main Street small businesses, or Main Street entrepreneurs, that was the term he used, Main Street entrepreneurs. So Ronnie, in the public discourse, entrepreneurs are often thought of as people who start high-tech and high-growth companies. It's sort of been a lot of the focus of policy around entrepreneurship. But in the CAP report that we released today, we talk about entrepreneurs in a broader context. As households that own a business is how we define it. So what exactly is an entrepreneur? What should we think about entrepreneurs? And how does it differ from a small business owner at all, or is it the same thing?
Great. Well, first of all, thanks, Kate, and thank you for everyone for being here. Good morning. The difference between small business, Main Street small business, high-tech entrepreneurs, these are things I've been thinking about for a long time, and they're a big part of the policy discussion. I think a lot of times I would sit in rooms in Washington, and we'd be talking about entrepreneurship, and people would have in mind something like Snapchat. And we'd be talking about venture capital and high-skilled immigration and really important issues that impact a lot of businesses, but not all of them. And then we have a separate set of discussions about access to credit, issues like the SBLF and the State Small Business Credit Initiative that would sort of apply to, I think, a larger set of businesses. So for my sort of estimate, I think that we need to think about these businesses in different ways. And I think it will help us in the policymaking process. And one thing I'm looking forward to in the next administration is thinking about how to constructively sort of build policy and frameworks for both of these kinds of businesses. I think would be very beneficial. So let me give you a couple examples. So if you think about the landscape of small business in the United States, maybe somewhere between 26 and 27 million entities that we're calling small businesses. As everyone in the audience knows, just a small fraction of those actually have employees. We're really talking somewhere between 21 and 22 million of those businesses are self-employed individuals. And then if you look at the rest, maybe around 600,000 have 10 employees or more. So when you start to break down the landscape and you start to understand, we're talking about, on one hand, individuals, then small businesses that will probably remain small, and then a very small group that might be thinking about raising something like outside capital. That should shift the discussion how we think about this. So when you're talking about small business policy, It's good to be specific about which group you're talking about. And what I thought was great about the CAP report is it's very sort of prescriptive in its notion about treating Main Street small business. And there's really too few conversations about that. And I think by narrowing the playing field, we can actually have a much more productive conversation. And maybe next time you'll invite me back to talk about Snapchat, okay?
Yeah, that next report maybe.
Yeah.
So I want to turn to Jessica because one of the reasons we highlight the SSBCI in our report is because it's particularly successful in increasing funding to small businesses and low and moderate income communities. And so from what you've seen from some of these state proposals for SSBCI funding, what do you think are some of the best practices that make these programs sort of so reach into those communities so well? And particularly, I know that you don't have particular data on women and minority small business owners, but we know that they're going into these communities. And so what sort of best practices are there that states have proposed, or how can policy be designed to encourage those best practices?
Sure. No problem. Excellent question. Excellent follow-up to Ronnie's points. So the great thing about SSBCI was the diversity of small business financing programs that it supported. About a third of the funding went into venture capital or equity programs. And as the Secretary remarked, this is also how we try to think about inclusive entrepreneurship, because 75% of VC dollars historically go to 3 markets in the US. And we were able to show that there really is talent that's being born in communities across America, and access to this funding is critical to growing those local economies. 2/3 of the funding went to lending or credit support programs. And the real best practice there that we saw is that states had the latitude to develop and design programs. There were 5 different types of programs that really targeted local market needs. So that could be different from a manufacturing state like Michigan or a city center like Detroit versus a place like California or North Dakota. We saw wildly different sort of local market needs, and we really gave local policymakers the tools to target those needs. And even with this wide flexibility, we still found that they chose to work with CDFIs. They chose to target businesses. 80% of the SSBCI transactions went to small businesses with 10 or fewer employees, the really small businesses, and 42% went to low to moderate income communities. And so I think the lesson that I take away is that allowing local communities to have flexibility in the toolkit that they have to target those business owners in those communities is really important.
So that sort of leads into some of Amy's areas of expertise and follows up with your question. So why is the dominant small business lending structure been inadequate thus far in sort of reaching out to these particular underrepresented groups of entrepreneurs? And what other types of programs provide the flexibility to help those communities?
I think the Secretary touched on this a bit, but and access to capital is absolutely important, but I think one thing that's equally important is the access to counseling, technical assistance, mentoring. These are the things that really make entrepreneurs, bankable. Traditional lending institutions are, for the most part, risk averse. By having access to these, and it's not this broad, just financial literacy, but it's very specific. Technical assistance, how to create a business plan, should I file as an S Corp versus an LLC, very practical knowledge that can make, them, traditional lending institutions can see them as a less risky investment. I think, that's kind of the pre-capital stage. And then once you have that capital, particularly for socially and economically disadvantaged communities, because the access to mentoring networks or the traditional formal, counseling and technical assistance program is not as robust, having that accompanied with the capital itself as a requirement can also be really helpful for ensuring the success of that entrepreneur. I think one of the programs that we see this done particularly well is the SBA's microloan program. So these are entrepreneurs who are not looking for $1 million to $5 million loans, but they're looking it's up to $2,000, $5,000, $10,000, up to $50,000. And as part of the requirement for getting a microloan, you have to get technical assistance and counseling to go with it. It just makes them a more successful borrower.
Yeah, that's great. So that sort of touches on how we broaden what we think of as a small business owner and making sure we value the small business owners who are going to stay small. And that's fine. Those are still very important to the economy. And so I want to turn, this also leads well to you, Luana, because you are a small business owner on this panel. I'm really excited to have you here. And so tell us just sort of briefly how it happened for you. So, how you first got, like, from the first inception idea that you wanted to do it yourself, you wanted to have a small business, what it was like navigating that process, what helped a lot, what you wished was there.
Sure, yeah. So when we were talking about this panel early on, I said, oh, what prompted me to start? That brief moment of insanity, you mean, that has now lasted 11 years? That's pretty much what it was. But I think I was working for another small business that I could see where they could be so much more successful if of course, they did what I wanted. But it was just that idea of, oh, I see where this is going, and you're working with that organization. And in any small business, but for those of us who have worked in one, you learn all of it, right? You start over here, but you're managing over there, and then you're running over here, and you start to learn and you see how the small business really works. And then you say, oh, maybe I can do this. And luckily with the Small Business Administration and that level of support and understanding some programs, you get the education, and that's really where it started for me, is just going and saying, okay, if I wanted to do this, what does that mean? And how would I go about it? And that's where I started. That's how I came up with the idea, and then, okay, now how do I actually do it? How do I get it done? So the education and the technical support is essential.
Yeah, one of the policies we put forward in our report is talking about something like an apprenticeship for small business owners.
Yeah.
Because I think that is a lot of that hands-on experience really helps. And if you do it through, you're working for a small business owner yourself, you're also able to earn income while you're learning the skills you need to start a small business. So I think that's formalizing that model, encouraging that model to have people really engage with the business owners they're working for in order to become business owners themselves can really help a lot. So I want to turn a little bit away from some of these issues, and I'm sure we'll come back to them. But I want to talk about the geographic context too, because this is something is sort of baked into the SSBCI, but it's also something that you, Ronnie, have a real expertise in, but the importance of geographic context. What makes certain places easier for people to start a business? Because there are small businesses all across the country, and we think of entrepreneurs, in the very narrow sense of high-tech people, it's just Silicon Valley and the Boston area, but there's small businesses across the country. What makes it more difficult or easier for certain people to start businesses across the country, and what can policy do to sort of help encourage other cities to become, and states to become friendlier places?
Sure. I mean, so one of the most popular things you'll hear now from my students who are MBAs or from the news media is the death of distance. Have people heard this? Distance doesn't matter, right? You can start a company anywhere because there's all this technology out there and the cost of starting businesses are lower. And there's a lot of truth to that. But look at some of the statistics, starting with the one Jessica mentioned. About 75% of the venture capital is concentrated in 3 states. A large amount of the innovation is concentrated in those 3 states as well. A lot of the wealth is now being sucked into our urban metro areas. If you look, one of the biggest stories of the last 25 years has been sort of the rebirth of American cities. And as you see so much economic activity moving to the urban areas where highly educated people are really sort of clustering near downtowns and doing things like starting companies like the ones we talked about. And small businesses are also part of that clustering because they're going to sprout up around other kinds of businesses as well, because that's great for sort of consumers and also for talent. But what does that mean for everywhere else? And that's where we see a lot of regional variation across the United States in terms of our ability to start businesses. And so I'm from North Carolina. Our rural areas in North Carolina have really been suffering as places like Raleigh-Durham and Charlotte have been thriving. And why is that? Because a lot of the economic activity, including the small businesses, has been sucked into those urban areas. And that's happened in states all across the country. And as you can see, it's had a huge impact on our politics and our discussions about economics as well. So one way to think about this in the future is how do we help different kinds of areas? And that's why the program that Jessica and Secretary Lew talked about, I think, is important because it was customizable in the sense that every region could decide how to use from a menu of, let's say, 5 kinds of programs. And that might have been one of the reasons why it's been deemed a success. The other thing is, place-based policies. How can we help places that have been sort of having trouble with this transition either sort of figure out ways to revive the industries that they've lost or reinvent themselves? And I think small businesses are going to be an incredibly important part of that because they're dynamic. They can add employees relatively quickly, and they're going to be on the cutting edge of doing new things. But it has to be something at the local level where we let policymakers there sort of make these decisions, because I certainly don't know, outside North Carolina, for example, what the best small business policy would be in a rural part of Virginia. It may be similar to North Carolina, it may not, but policymakers there might have a strategic plan to figure that out. Place-based policies have a mixed record, to be honest. I think we need to work on identifying which ones have worked and which ones haven't and why. But that would be another priority, I think, in terms of building policy in this area. And small and medium-sized enterprises are going to be the engine of revitalization no matter where you look.
Can I follow up with that too? When we're looking at the sort of diversity issues and the inclusiveness issues. I think of Boston and Silicon Valley and both as not the most racially diverse places, or most racially integrated places, and also those industries tend to be very male-dominated industries. And so what is the interplay between both geographic context and place-based policies and encouraging more diverse business ownership?
Yeah, you have this feedback loop, right? I mean, people who are starting businesses in a lot of these areas, exactly like you, they worked at other companies, right? So you're drawing from the networks that are in these areas, and if the networks are not very diverse, and if our networks are pretty segregated along gender and race, for example, you're going to get businesses that are going to look very similar on those characteristics. I mean, a lot of it has to do, I think, and we'll talk about this later maybe, in terms of opening up the network. So we get to know people who are different than us. So when we're thinking about, for example, who to staff a panel discussion for, we're not going to pick the usual suspects, right? I mean, this is the first time I've ever been on a panel talking about economics and business that looks like this. Okay, that's the first time it's ever happened. And I think part of the reason is probably because Kate was a big part of choosing people, and you went to look for people who are unparalleled in expertise. Let's be honest. There's no one in this panel who doesn't have the expertise, but maybe putting us together in a way that hasn't happened before. It's the same thing with venture capital boards. It's the same thing with small business hiring. It's the same thing of people who staff the SBA centers. It's all part of the equation, and this is where our regional issues are going to intersect with diversity.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it was easy to put together a panel that was diverse. If the people are there, they're smart. You just need to make sure that you're not, ignoring other people.
That's right.
So we had talked a little bit about sort of these informal education and creating of business networks, how that sort of takes place in communities, and like what we can do to encourage more of that sort of development, because a lot of it is pretty informal, and I'm trying to think of the ways in which policy can encourage these informal types of education and network building in order to encourage more diversity in entrepreneurship.
I think, typically the best mentoring relationships are the ones that happen organically. But if you're in a position, if you're in a community, or if you're a part of a demographic where that doesn't help you, where your inner circle, your network doesn't consist of other entrepreneurs, at that point, I think it's helpful to look to the formal kind of networking, mentoring programs. SCORE is a great example. 350 chapters, 13,000 volunteers all over the country look like typical white male small business owners, but also have people that look like me, look like you. It is those types of networks, and they're volunteer based. So these are people who have done it before, who have bootstrapped, started their own business, and really want to give back to other potential entrepreneurs. Being an entrepreneur is a very isolating, lonely experience. So having these kind of formal places where you can seek out this, what do I do, or kind of have that formal Q&A with somebody who's been there is going to be helpful, particularly for socially and economically disadvantaged communities.
Yeah, that sounds great. It sounds almost like writing a dissertation is like maybe becoming a small business
Yeah.
owner, and then it's very isolating, and having those networks of people who look like you,
Right.
who are easy to access, would help a lot.
And I would just add to that, oftentimes, in many instances, the first real business advice a business owner gets is when they come in to apply for credit. And so one of the things that I wanted to highlight about both of our programs, SSBCI and SBLF, is that they worked with specialized, high-touch community development financial institutions. These are lenders that are certified by the CD85 Fund, which is another Treasury Department program, that they serve borrowers in low-income communities. And I think that why that is important is because they're able to provide not just credit extension, but they can go through a business plan, they can understand the business owner, understand where they want to go, and help give them counseling and technical assistance around just the credit extension.
Yeah. I'll lead into this. I think we've talked about this in the past, but I know that there's research that you're more likely to become an entrepreneur and small business owner yourself if your parent was. And so it's if you're part of communities, that's more common. If you have exposure to it, it's more common. But then how do we help groups of people who don't have that? And people aren't going in, they have to first have the idea to be a small business owner before they're going to get credit. And so how do we encourage communities, people who have lower rates of small business ownership, to start small businesses, and particularly at younger ages? I know this is something that you and I have talked about.
Yeah, this is near and dear. I really would love to see something where it's taught in public high schools, not only in private high schools, but in public high schools at the level where these kids are, maybe as a senior, where you're getting some level of education of not only what entrepreneurship is, but yes, you too can, because in these communities, you need that kind of boost of, I have an idea, but now what do I do? well, yeah, you too can become an entrepreneur, and we're going to give you the tools right here in your local high school that at least explains the process to you and explains what that means. And picking up on that, the whole idea as an entrepreneur of going into a bank, it's terrifying. But, you know, we were talking about the new ABCs, right? Teaching in high school, again, asset, bank, credit, collateral, debt, equity, so that kids, again, understand what that means before they even take that move. So now you've encouraged them, you've gotten some kind of fire in them going. And now, oh, okay, let's make them successful by giving them some of the other tools and understanding what it is to manage money and understanding that when they send you that credit card, just because now you're 18, let's understand again, debt, you know, what do these things really mean? And it's not just that free money that, you know, if you've never seen that before, you're thinking, wow, this is great, I love America, but you have to understand what comes with that.
Yeah, because I think there's also lots of ways in which young people sort of already naturally have that entrepreneurial spirit. They already have that hustle, but giving them the actual concrete tools to like turn that hustle into a formal business is like, crucial. Yeah.
There is a great program. I think it's it's associated with the National Lemonade Stand Day, and it's great, and it's one of those things that kids are already doing, and it kind of harnesses that. There are other programs. I think Girl Scouts is a great another organization. They're already doing this as part of their general mission, and they're incorporating that, and they're doing it for communities. I love that it's girls. They're focusing on that. But we can take those things that we don't have to recreate the wheel. We can take the programs that already exist that other nonprofits and other community-based organizations are doing in this area and figure out how to support those. To really leverage it in other places.
And just two things on training to keep in mind also that goes along with this. One is the outcome of a successful training program isn't necessarily more entrepreneurs. You know, people might learn about themselves, and not everyone wants to follow on his path, right? I mean, you'd be crazy, right? Entrepreneurship's tough. It's very risky. but having the opportunity to try things out in an apprenticeship or a public education context can be really valuable for people to say, hey, maybe I'll be more of a joiner. I'll work for a small business, or maybe I'll go work for a large company. This isn't for me, but you get to try things out. And the second thing I'd say is the training is, as she's pointing out with managing your own bank account, it's not just about entrepreneurship. You can use these skills in a wide variety of contexts. It's like a general purpose thing.
Yeah.
So people are worried about, sort of jiggering our curriculum so it's very specific to business. No, you'd be learning skills that could be good for financial literacy, career management, soft skills, all sorts of things that we think are important in the career. So I think that's where training can really be valuable.
Yeah, that's something that I've thought of too. It's part of it's just making sure that people have the tools they need, and sometimes that means that people aren't going to go into it, and that's also good because starting a business is very risky, and you can lose a lot by unsuccessfully starting.
But learning that when you are younger and you really understand versus just jumping in because you don't have enough information and now you're in a different place, it makes a big difference. It can make a big difference in your life.
Yeah, and particularly I've heard that sometimes people try false starts multiple times where they finally get that one idea where they start a good business, but certain people don't have the luxury to do that. If you're from a riskier financial background, you're not going to have the luxury to do that. Yeah, so I think those are all really good points. And so I want to turn a little bit to sort of this long-term decline that we've seen in small business ownership. That if you have a previous CAP report, 1 million missing entrepreneurs highlighted, and then we echo again in this report that this is not just a function of the financial crisis. This has sort of really been a longer-term decline. And so some of the programs like SSBCI were started in a particular moment in our economy in 2010, where things were more dire then, and now it's we're encouraging to reauthorize it because we think it should be like a long-term program. And so, so Jessica, we've talked about this before. What are some ways we can make sure that we're having policy that is designed to sort of more permanently prop up the small business economy?
Sure. No, I think it's great. Great question. I think that one of the reasons why we so strongly support reauthorization of SSBCI is because we've seen the good it's done for both small businesses, but for local economic development and local communities as well. And I think that it's really important to think about it in that holistic context. The funding that SSBCI provided states actually supports 147 active state financing programs. More than half of these were new and did not exist before this funding. And it's really uncertain if states will have the funds to sort of continue to operate these programs without reauthorization. And so I think it points to a really critical need for financing programs that support exactly the types of entrepreneurs that we're talking about. Main Street entrepreneurs, folks that may need a little bit of help either with technical assistance and coaching or with some sort of credit support in order to be able to get access to capital to grow their business. And so I think it's a really critical ongoing need in communities. And we very much hope that it continues.
Ronnie, so from what you know from your research looking at this geographic context, how has that shifted over time, and what can that tell us?
Yeah, so one worrying sign in the economy right now over the last, let's say, 15, 20 years is the decline in economic dynamism in general. So you can sort of bunch in sort of rates of business starts, but also people moving from place to place. Americans used to be sort of very well known for being much more mobile across places compared, let's say, to other parts of the world. There's some disturbing trends in those numbers that indicate maybe that's not as much the case anymore. And other sort of measures like people switching jobs, those things tend to be going in the wrong direction historically, and this is something that's broader than any administration. So if you think about this, why is economic dynamism sort of declining at a time when we think like we're living in this world of innovation where there's all this entrepreneurship and all these things going on, all these clusters? Again, I think it's two very different parts of the story. Yes, we have these clusters with amazing innovation. We're going to have vehicles that drive themselves, right? We already do. On the other hand, the kinds of small businesses we've been talking about, right, they have actually been in this long-term decline. Now, there's some ways to count the numbers that people can say, well, it's coming up or down. But in general, that's been a long-term trend. And it's going to hurt places primarily that are outside of those geographic clusters because that's where you don't have the support. And that's where if you don't have one of these programs that got set up after the 2010 Small Business Jobs Act, you could be out of luck. So I think that's where you really want to look at the margin of small businesses. I also want to say, the SBLF, when I was at the White House when they were doing it in Treasury, it was really interesting that they connected it to the percentage of small business loans, right, that the partners gave out. That was really innovative at the time. And I remember worrying a lot of how that was going to work and whether it was going to work. Now, 6 years later, we can see some of the benefits. But it's those kind of policy decisions in those really uncertain times. 2010 was a completely different time, right, that can make a big difference. And I think we're at these moments again where we're looking at a very different economy and we need to think about designing policy to meet these new challenges because we certainly did in 2010 with these two programs.
Yeah.
It's a great point, and it worked great, guys. So SBLF was able to leverage a $4 billion investment into 332 institutions into $18.7 billion in new small business loans around the country. And it did that through this incentive rate mechanism that Ronnie just mentioned, where the more a bank lent, the lower they paid back Treasury. And it's just incredible, and it's such a flexible tool. That really, if we were ever in that situation again, the reports that we released today have been able to prove the impact of this program and just how quick and flexible and scalable it is.
Yeah, but I also think we're in an interesting moment in our sort of economic history right now where we are recovered from the financial crash of 2008, but there's still groups of people who continually are left behind. And so that was one thing we were writing this report, thinking that, that even though the economy is recovered in many ways, certain groups of workers continue and business owners continue to perpetually be left behind. They're still where they were before 2008. They're still not doing as well. So we're trying to think of ways to focus on the margins, focus on those business owners that have the hardest time trying to start a business. And Luana, you're doing some work with Small Business Majority, particularly creating platforms for women business owners and for minority business owners. And I know that those are still in the developmental stage, but what kind of issues what are you guys looking at with those platforms?
The same issues that we're talking about here on this panel: education, starting with youth, starting to get them excited. In that early stage when you can really mold them and shape them, access to capital, every aspect that you can think of as a woman entrepreneur and then as a minority entrepreneur, understanding that they're different. And we want to create a platform for information sharing, for conversation, for potential mentorship, so that if you are a part of this platform, you go in as a woman-owned business and you can say, has anyone ever experienced this? And you have this safe community of folks who, yeah, maybe I have, but this is a different way that I looked at it and this is what I did. And so it gives you just a feeling of comfort. It gives you okay, I have, this might be someone in California, never met this person, but there's someone who can mentor me even for that minute to get me through this situation that is within a great community that you can trust. Yeah. So I'm really excited about when we'll get these platforms out.
Yeah, that'd be great. I know there are lots of organizations trying to put together things like this, and I think Small Business Majority sort of has the breadth to have an umbrella for a lot of those people to engage in those types of things. Yeah, so that sounds really great. And so, do you have any follow-up questions?
I think, I was working for the Senate when we were putting together SBLF and SSBCI, and it was a unique time. I think there's a real desire to reauthorize these programs, but I think it's a matter of, a lot of it's education. It's member education. It's educating these members on how this affects their particular district, their particular state. Because we've given so much flexibility, there's no kind of one pager that you can give to every member to say this is these are the 10 talking points as to why you should reauthorize this program. It's so flexible that different communities are doing different things, and so there's a lot more work to be done in terms of educating members as to why they need to reauthorize it. And I think it's going to take some significant effort. Right now we're in a particularly awkward time. No one's here in DC, but I think when people come back, it's going to be worth looking at how we can really effectively communicate to members of Congress. This is important, and this is why.
So I'm so glad you mentioned that. Part of what my crack team has been working on for the last year, the appendix to the SSBCI report goes through every state program in every state. We weren't able to condense it to a one-pager, and it kills me. It's probably a couple of pages per state, because we wanted to really cover the breadth of every program in every state. But it is, with any kind of new program, there's always an unfamiliarity. It hasn't been around as long as SBA, and so there's that education hurdle to overcome. And so one of the things that we've really tried to do with the reports released today is sort of make sure there's that legacy, and to make sure, at least for SSBCI, on that appendix with a state-by-state basis, you guys have the tools you need.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is sort of an open question. I think all of you have expertise in this area, but this tension of local geographic context matters so much.
Yeah,
but we are in DC right now, and we do think a lot about sort of federal policy and how we link those two things up, particularly. So it could be anything from how do we engage federal policymakers to care about creating a program that helps people do highly specific local policy. So how do we link these two things up in a way that is seamless?
I think it's hard for the reasons that Ami just mentioned. Anytime you're talking about a diverse set of programs and you're trying to condense it into sort of what are your 5 sort of main talking points for reauthorization or extension, I think for me, the big takeaways are, these programs have been successful. SBLF, as the Secretary said, $4 billion investment, $18.7 billion in small business lending, and it's estimated to return $51 million to taxpayers. It didn't cost us anything. Those are powerful talking points, I think, for the Hill. On SSBCI, I think the big one is around flexibility and diversity, and just how far that really can go to support communities and encourage inclusive entrepreneurship. We've successfully proven with this program that there are strong opportunities for early stage investment and venture capital investment outside the 3 main markets where the private sector seems to think those are the only opportunities. We've also successfully shown that states can develop and support these programs. Financial institutions, community banks, CDFIs like working with their state and local leaders, having the flexibility. It's a little bit more flexible than SBA, but we love SBA. But that has advantages in terms of the types of Main Street entrepreneurs that you can serve, the types of coaching you can do. The microloan program at SBA is great, but our capital access programs, have just, I think, been bigger.
And I think that comes back down to the education again, and just for an entrepreneur to know really all of the programs that are there and almost have a platform of comparison. Well, this is this one, and this is what it does, and this is this one, and this is what it does, because a bookstore is going to have a different need than I am in a different location. And if they're not doing the internet, it's very different. So to have some kind of, the idea of the one-pager based on geography, but maybe even based on type of business, you can say, if I am in Washington, D.C., and I have a restaurant, what would make sense for me? Right. I don't know if I could answer that question, right, in terms of the type
Right.
of capital that would make sense for that business in that location doing that thing.
You could pair this with the one-stop shops, you know what I mean? So the
Yeah.
one-stop shops in several states, Michigan, Ohio are the two that I know best, I think. But you could pair this, right? That's a way to look at regulatory issues, licenses that a restaurant would need. But you could also put there sort of resources that you might be likely to use, right? Because you can divide up the possible candidates for small business in a few categories, 10 even. And you can build an easy database that basically gives the most likely resources. And there could be a ability to search for other things. And that could help people answer some of those questions.
This was actually done in that Startup in a Day,
Yeah.
and it encouraged, in cities that we don't normally think of as being, it's not the 6 cities that tend to be the startup hubs, and it really encouraged local, municipalities to figure out a way to come together, bring the different levels of government to come together and say, how can we create an environment, an entrepreneurial ecosystem that's going to help, individuals, all individuals, but particularly individuals that we don't typically think of being entrepreneurs, to become, small business owners.
And I think it's also really important, at least from my perspective, to meet business owners where they are. I know there's a lot of focus in the policy space. How do we create better mentorship programs? How do we create training that actually drives people in? But a lot of times, you could be running your family business for a year, or you could be a new entrepreneur, and you're just looking, you're busy, you're out there, you're trying to do it, you're trying to make your business a success. A lot of times your first point of access is when you try to get credit or talk to someone. Mm-hmm. So making sure that we are supporting the financial intermediaries that these business owners work with, right? And making sure that states and those financial intermediaries know the breadth of tools. I think it'd be almost impossible for business owners to know the breadth of federal programs available to them. And it's hard to convey that information. It's probably not useful information to most of them. It's more the education and outreach we do with the intermediaries that the entrepreneurs themselves interact with.
Yeah, and then also with the one-stop shops that we sort of outline in the report, the idea is that business owners already have to sort of interact with the municipal government in some way, or state or municipal government in some way anyway. If they want to register their business, if they want to pay their business taxes, do any of that stuff, they're going there.
That's the point. Meet them where they are.
Exactly. Integrate it, and in that we sort of, also encourage merging them with the self-employment assistance program, so that people who are going to receive unemployment insurance while they also do this. And so, same thing. You are already interacting with the municipal system if you're getting unemployment insurance. So how do you sort of pair all these things together to meet business owners where they already are and help them out?
So that they know that they are even there, that they even exist. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I think one thing that we probably don't do enough of is emphasize, and this is particularly on the Hill, but just generally why this is important to, everybody. It's not just about, supporting socially and economically disadvantaged communities. When any part of the economy is operating inefficiently, the whole economy is operating inefficiently. It is a national economic imperative to ensure that these communities are operating at optimal efficiency. That means, public investment in these communities to really kind of, I think the phrase is rising tides lifts all boats. It's going to help everyone if we do this.
And it's also important to recognize that small businesses are the backbone of our economy because they're the big job creators. The research, 2 out of 3 net new jobs over the last 2 decades, and as Ronnie said earlier, those are really the 600,000 or so employer firms. And these guys are, that's the core of our economic dynamism, but when you think of how narrow that strip is. And so we really need, like you said, all boats rowing, not to overkill the metaphor.
Right.
but yeah.
This is something you sort of touched on in your first comments about how this is a reflection overall of an economy that, people aren't moving around as much. There's not as much labor mobility in the economy, and it's something I try to emphasize in the report, and I think, could be made even stronger, is that it's part of someone's occupational choice to start a business, and if we're having an economy where certain occupational choices aren't available to people, that is a sort of a labor market that's not operating as efficiently as it could. It's better for everyone to be in jobs that they are most productive in, and to make sure people can move around. And so, do you have any ideas about how to sort of make this argument that it's good for the entire economy to have more business dynamism?
So sure, another way to think about this question is the issue of occupational licensing, right? So occupational licensing hasn't come up in this discussion, but when you think about sort of rules and regulations that impact people of color, women especially, you think about a lot of the professions that are licensed, and there's a lot of variation across states in those amounts of hours, for example, it takes to become a cosmetologist in North Carolina versus South Carolina, which is one that I've looked at, or a dental hygienist or a daycare worker. And there are lots of laws on the books that are there for very important public safety reasons, so we need to figure that out. But there are some maybe where you could think about, could we streamline the process or at least make it more transparent so there wouldn't be these big differences across state lines, and maybe that could open up entrepreneurship for a whole new set of people who wouldn't otherwise have that opportunity. Because right now, those occupational choices are being limited. And that's something that has received a lot of bipartisan attention, which is a good sign. One of the nice things about this issue, I think what makes us all happy, is you can actually have conversations with people about it. I mean, I think it might be the only issue left, right? But I mean, with small business, at least we can talk across the table to different kinds of people, and this issue of licensing is one that maybe we could look at. I think the devil is in the details, though, in terms of how you think about it and what mechanism you use to alleviate some of these constraints without sort of jettisoning policies that are really important to protect the public safety. But this is something that would be in that category.
Yeah, public safety, and also I think it helps those workers formalize their skills.
Definitely.
So again, it's like it's a skill building tool for a lot of those workers. In order to do that, I think I had a friend who was on unemployment insurance and was able to sort of do one of these programs where you get occupational licensing, and she became like a high-end nail technician. And like, so there are ways to sort of pair these things together. It does help workers, but we need to figure out what is just creating a system that people can get into and what is helping people.
I think some of the policies that can really help this really have nothing to do with small business at all. I mean, these are like the general middle class building policies. I think a great example of this, when we saw this back in 2009 when we were debating the Affordable Care Act, one of the arguments that we used for why this is good in creating these exchanges is it eliminates job lock. It gives you the opportunity to leave that job to start your own business. So policies that really kind of have nothing to do with SBA or Treasury can really actually help to make entrepreneurial development that much easier.
Yeah, so you don't work on health insurance. So that's sort of one of those things that
Right.
helps with alleviate job lock.
Right.
To have health insurance
Right.
that's more accessible
Yeah,
to people.
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. So I wanted to open it up for questions in the audience, unless you guys have any follow-up questions for each other. I mean, you guys are also here all on this, all experts, and you could all sort of engage in a discussion with each other, I'm sure, for a long time. But I'd love to hear if people in the audience have questions. Up front.
Hi, good morning. My name is Dr. Malcolm Beach, and I'm with an organization called the National Business League. It's the National Trade Association for African American business owners. And my question really deals with diversity and whether or not you've been able to match up the census tracts, poverty level, with entrepreneurship and wealth creation. In other words, when you talk about entrepreneurship, that's the fastest way to build wealth, which is the opposite of poverty. Okay, so when you do these studies and make your policies, are you tying together the outcomes? Is there a report that says based on, well, for instance, there was a report about the SBA that said that African American businesses got less than 6% of the loans. Well, that's a direct relationship to access to capital, wealth creation, and the poverty reduction in the African American community. So I'm just saying, when you go through your discussions about policy, where does diversity fit in to the measurement of whether you're successful or not?
Yeah, I know. It's difficult because there's not a lot of, we don't measure a lot of diversity in our banking system, who it's reaching out to. But I think you can also sort of speak to one of the successes of the SSBCI is that it does engage a lot of community banks, which tend to be in more minority communities, tend to have better outreach in minority communities, and so that's one way that it happens.
I can try to answer that, and one part of this is going a little bit outside my expertise, but the CFPB right now is standing up. There was a provision in Dodd-Frank, Section 1071, that we should start collecting hum-to-leg data or demographic data around small business lending. All banks should report out this, and they've just hired a wonderful gentleman who came from the SBA, Grady Hedgebeth, and they have a team in place, and they're working on coming up with a survey protocol and what they would collect and fielding that with the banks to capture exactly the type of information that you've identified that we need and that we already capture sort of in the home mortgage setting. And so that'll take a few years, but I think that policymakers recognize that there's a need for this. It's already been passed into law, and we're a few years away from the data coming. I think that in the absence of having that data now, as we stood up these two programs at Treasury at the time that we did, both programs specified in the statute that, whether it was the community banks that worked with SBLF or the state and local entities that received SSBCI funding, they had to have a plan to target underserved. Whether that was minority-owned, women-owned, but they had to have a plan to target underserved. And they provided those plans to us. SBLF, as the Secretary mentioned, released a report on that. And then SSBCI, what we use as an admittedly imperfect proxy is the percent of funding and transactions, loans and transactions that went to LMI communities, low to moderate income communities. And we have found, as a very flexible policy tool, 42% of our transactions went to low to moderate income communities. So we use that as a way to sort of gauge, to try to measure how we're doing on the back end. And we try to drive policy on the front end with saying, you need to provide a plan to us to target these communities and these business owners.
I think for those programs where the government has a direct relationship with, with the program, the SBA has done it. Two programs I could think off the top of my head is the 8A program, which is it's a contracting program that requires that a certain percentage of contracts be set aside, government contracts be set aside for minority-owned firm to 8A firms, named after the Section 8A of the Small Business Act. The other program off the top of my head is the HUB Zone, historically underutilized business zone program. These are, of course, primarily they're contracting programs. These because it's government contracting. It's things that are wholly within the purview of government's control. I think where we see it become a little bit more difficult is when we're looking with non-government markets, private lending institutions. These are we have to walk a very fine line in how much control we try to exert on these markets, because it could have potentially unintended consequences we're not aware of.
Yeah, John.
John Arnsmeyer, Small Business Majority. I think one of the reasons that we're seeing a reduction, let's say, in the SBA loans to minorities is, in general, the average loan banks, the average amount's gone way up, and the need hasn't really changed. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And this is even with the community banks, although obviously the SSBCI program really does focus on those. And so I think that's creating a lot of the problem, and we're seeing this need being filled by alternative online and other lenders out there. Obviously, we view some of that as good, and some of it is, problematic because of the predatory lending that's going on. So I kind of wanted you to address the sort of, this is kind of a structural issue, but I think it's having an impact on women and minorities getting certainly traditional financing. If you have any thoughts about how that can be resolved.
So, if you guys would, I'll go first. I think part of it, as you alluded to, is sort of the cost structure of lending. It costs, I think, Karen Mills has a stat on this. It costs a community bank, almost the same to underwrite a loan, whether it's $100,000 or $200,000 as it does if it's $1 million. And so you do see a shift in sort of the size of loans they're underwriting and the products that they're sort of moving business owners into. I think on the alternative lending, online marketplace lending space, Treasury has done some work here. We released a white paper last May where we sort of said, technology, data, new tools and instruments that are out there hold enormous potential to fill some of this gap for unsecured, lower dollar loans for businesses without, that aren't good candidates for traditional bank loans, unsecured credit, less than 3 years operating history. But it has to be done in a manner that's safe and affordable. It just has to. And even with these new alternative lenders, it's still, particularly on the small business side, a very, very small share of the overall small business lending market. And so I think that leaves an important space for programs like SBA, SSBCI, the CDFI fund, SBLF. I'm sorry, government is a laundry list of acronyms. But there's an important role for these programs to play in providing safe and affordable credit to businesses in the communities where they are, and providing those wraparound services that help the business owner not just get the loan, but understand how much they can afford to take on, understand what the plan is for their business to grow, and get that support.
And I think a lot of this as well is sort of providing a good alternative to this sort of alternative lending while that whole system is sort of working itself out and becoming a safe thing, but providing a really accessible alternative to alternative lending. And there was a program that you and I have discussed in the past that's an SBA program that's not operated through banks, but through community institutions.
That's the microloan program,
So stuff like the microloan program that if people have knowledge of them, that's sort of a big key, is making sure
Right.
people are aware of them, but providing other non-traditional business lending that is really available to people instead of the online
Right.
banking.
Wait, I think your question is also very pertinent. I mean, this is one of the great innovations that we're living through in this market, but it also presents a little bit of a conundrum for people on the policy side, and something we've been thinking a lot about in academia as well. Yeah, an analogy that might work would be something like for-profit education, which in a lot of places around the country has had a big impact in people's access to education. But of course, we're aware of sort of some of the abuses of that model, and some recent examples stand out. So when you think about an innovation like online lending, I think the first thing is there's different varieties, right? So some of these businesses are raising money from investors and holding the risk on their balance sheets when they make the loans. Other ones are sort of brokers that are going to connect small businesses to potential lenders. That's like a biz to credit is one that's well known. And then some of them are peer-to-peer lending, which is a different thing entirely. So when you look at those three categories, each of them present some different challenges in terms of we want to encourage innovation, but we do have to make sure some of the things that Jessica talked about are taken into account. I think the hope is that a lot of the bias that we see in human interactions in the lending process could be obviated by sort of online. You know, as someone who studies this stuff for a living, like the evidence is not actually clear that algorithms and robots are more fair than you and me. There's a lot of work to be done there. But that is, I think, the hope that so we can make the process more efficient by leveraging big data and doing these things online. And I think you're going to need experimentation to figure that out, but we should think about some of the downsides as we go through. So I think it's an area for policy and for academics to be working on a lot.
I think on the SBA side, I mean, it's an evolution. The program is never just stops, improving. And I think that's something that they're looking at, and they're looking at the data. How much is going out at the $5 million mark, the $3 million mark versus the $1 million mark or the $500,000 mark, and figuring out ways that they can, within their legislative constraints, incentivize lending institutions that are participating in the SBA loan program, in the 7A program, the 504 program, to really get to those lower dollar loans, but they can only do so much. There's only so much flexibility baked into the program. Some of that requires statutory changes, and those are things, those take time. And by the time we get to the point where we're fixing it, the problem's evolved, it's changed. So I think, but it is something that they're looking at, and they're trying to figure out ways that they can address that.
Back here.
Hi, Ryan Bandari. I'm a policy advisor at Third Way. My question is, one of the common threads that almost all entrepreneurs have is that they come from wealthy backgrounds in the U.S. They have rich parents, which makes sense because, as you touched on, there's a lot of risk involved in starting a business, and it helps if you fail to be able to count on wealthy parents to bail you out. But from a policy perspective, how do you mitigate this issue? Because it just seems that inherent in the system, there's always going to be an unlevel playing field for entrepreneurship.
Yeah, I mean, that is very true.
So what's interesting, I recently read a SBM, a Small Business Majority report that for millennials and those who are younger starting businesses, they're not from wealthy families. They're just kind of like me, just starting up with $500 at your kitchen table. And they're doing that because, you are younger, right? And you have that opportunity to fail because I can do it again. But that is the common, thought that, oh, wow, yeah, my dad left this business to me, and so that's why I have it. But I know for the millennials and the younger generations, they're going to start more, not because of being an inheritance, but just because, again, going back to that understanding when you're younger, you're getting this education, and you're getting that fire in you that I can be an entrepreneur. That's where you're really going to start in looking at starting a business without having the wealth and the background. I didn't have that. There's no one else really in my family that's an entrepreneur. It's just, again, that just having that understanding and thinking through, maybe I can do this. and stepping out there.
Yeah, I would challenge the notion that entrepreneurs by and large are usually coming from wealthy backgrounds. I think one of the a great community to highlight where we see this is not at all how it works, but yet we've got a disproportionate disproportionate number of successful entrepreneurs is immigrant entrepreneurs. I mean, we've seen tons of data that's come out over the last 10 years that show immigrant entrepreneurs are higher business starts, a greater proportion of successful business starts. So I don't know that is in fact necessarily true, and I think there are ways that we can look at how immigrant entrepreneurs are approaching it from a risk evaluation mindset. Like, is it okay to fail? Can I do this? And see how we can kind of encourage that thinking, that entrepreneurial thinking, that entrepreneurial spirit in other communities and other areas.
Yeah, and I think also, so your question basically is like, how do we address structural inequality in the economy? It's a huge thing. A lot of different factors are at play here that are just maintaining these structures of inequality. And one of the effects could be, for some people, it's hard to start a business, because I know your point that 6% of business of African Americans get traditional business loans, because a lot of people do get funding through personal connections, and so if you don't have those personal connections, it is difficult to start a business in some ways, which is why I think a lot of the previous CAP products on entrepreneurship talks about the need for just broad-based progressive policy to address just generally economic inequality. Things like student loans, something like that. If you have more student loans, it's going to be harder to be able to finance a business startup. And so that's something that argues for just better education funding in this country. So a lot of these things I think are just broad-based progressive policies that boost up the middle class, boost up lower income folks, and that itself will have the effect of making it easier for people to start businesses. There's one in the back there.
Small Business Committee, and we're very much looking forward to the reauthorization in 2017 and working on all sorts of things with this program, but also others in the Small Business Committee to do all the things that we've been talking about today. So I wanted to dig into a little bit more the issue of counseling and how we can use and enhance existing programs at SBA, at Treasury, and in the communities to help small business owners who already have an idea, who are already getting their start, who are sort of in the thinking stages. I mean, it's important to support education beforehand, but how can we enhance what we have around small business counseling?
Yeah, great question.
That's a great question. I love it, and I totally didn't plan that. I promise. Thank you. So I think one of the great models that SBA has, as well as MBDA, another organization, they don't provide the counseling themselves. It's not like you've got SBA staff who are doing the one-on-one with the entrepreneurs. What they're doing is they're providing grants. It's a grant model to for SBDCs, small business development centers, which are statutorily required to be based in universities. They're providing grants to these universities to work with others, state, local, regional economic development entities to come up with ways to provide that counseling to entrepreneurs in their area. The Women's Business Center program, they do it through primarily nonprofits. For veterans business outreach centers, they're different. It's the same model, but they're using different institutions in order to be able to provide that service delivery. And I think that's really important. It gives an inherent flexibility. Counseling is not one size fits all. Different regions, different geographic regions, different demographics take information differently. And having different resource partners provide that information, provide that counseling is critical to being able to leverage and maximize the other programs that are wholly within the government space.
Yeah, and Luana, you also, since you're so involved with in the small business community, so you're sort of actively participating in developing some of these structures to provide counseling.
Yeah, because it is essential, and again, going back to SBM, and I'm really not here to plug it, but it's just making sense that again, that platform and the exchange of information, more peer-to-peer. I love the SBA programs, but sometimes they're a little higher, a little regulatory, and when I have a question about this is what is happening to me today, I need a peer that has experienced that and understands that versus someone in that regulatory environment who's going to point me to something else. I need someone who's like, oh yeah, I experienced that yesterday, and this is what we do. And so making sure that we have that peer-to-peer understanding, or even within the SBA and the SCORE and the MBDAs and
Minority
all of
Business
them,
Development Agency, yeah.
to make sure that there are volunteer business owners who are right there. And I know a lot of times they use retirees, but it's, it's different. You need someone who's right there, real time, someone who, like me, has been, in the business today, and I take 2 hours so that I can talk to someone else who is in their business now going through something that's similar. I have another question.
Sorry, let me bring the mic around.
I would ask a follow-up question about the difference. Do you think there's a difference in service delivery between the SBA, MBDA programs versus a hired paid consultant to do the same thing? In other words, the SBA programs take you only so far,
Right.
but they don't get you what you asked for in the first place,
Right.
you know. Whereas a consultant, if you're paying them whatever by the hour, by the job, that's what they got to give you the end product, because
Right.
that's what you're paying them for. So,
And so that's any analysis that a business owner is going to make, right? Do I have the money to pay for that consultant because I know I'm going to get it right that minute? Or if not, I know I can go to SBA and get somewhere, and then by getting somewhere, then maybe I can get to the end. So, there are going to be choices when you're in business. Folks will say, well, I love my attorney and I pay them $60 an hour, but it takes them a month to get it done. Well, I love mine too, and I'm going to pay them $400 because I want it done today. So that's just it's a balance of what you need for yourself as that business owner. I don't think anyone can say, yep, get a consultant and don't do that SBA thing because it's going to take you longer. That person has to see what each has to offer, because you can pay $1 million for a business consultant and they can give you something that's really not what you need as well. So,
Other questions? Right up here, and then after that in the back.
Hi, my name is Michelle Marcello. I'm with Ridge Policy Group, and I just have a question and wanted to know your thoughts on SBIR, Small Business
Innovation Research.
Yeah.
Report,
Do you have any thoughts or anything on that?
I can tell you that the Senate, the chair and ranking member of the Small Business Committee, which has jurisdiction over this program, have been working tirelessly to try and get this thing reauthorized. It's one of the most important programs for encouraging and fostering innovation. It's basically free money for small business owners, to provide what the government needs in a really kind of unique space. I think right now it's just a matter of timing. We've got so many weeks before the end of the Congress, and we've got to get a lot of things done. But it is definitely for our committee, it's the top priority right now, in trying to get it done this Congress, if we can.
SBIR leverages, one of our true competitive advantages in the United States. We talked about this before. So, she attended a school that's an ACC rival of mine, but I really respect.
My school is amazing.
Yeah. So Virginia Tech is a good example, as is North Carolina State, in the sense that there's so many great ideas that are in universities, but a lot of times academics either don't have the time or capability to figure out what to do with them. And with all these great innovations, programs like SBIR can help us spin those out and actually start real companies around them and generate a lot of economic activity in the local area, especially in places that aren't in some of these major metros but have a great research university. Think Purdue or Cornell University, for example. So I think it's one of these programs on the translational side that can really make a huge difference, and it's leveraging something that the United States is really good at. So in that sense alone, we should keep it going.
So I have a follow-up to that, because there are technical programs out there to provide education for commercialization of patents and of products. And actually, unbelievably, we have a contract with a federal organization to do just that, right? So I won't say the organization, but in the labs, mad scientists creating all of these patents, and then it's like, yay, we have a patent, and then what? Right, so the idea is to bring in minority and women business owners to help them understand what the patents are and how what they can do to them, and then take on, that's another level of entrepreneurship, right? I want to commercialize that project or that patent. How do I commercialize it? And then you go but then you have to lead into understanding what SBIR can bring to the table when you're trying to do that.
Thank you for bringing
Yeah.
it back
Yeah,
full
that's
circle.
why, yeah.
And I'll just build on that with, SSBCI, we talked about the venture capital programs, and a lot of the very successful states have partnered, exactly as you mentioned, commercialization of research that's going on in universities. So Ben Franklin Technology Partners in Pennsylvania is a very successful example. Hawaii has a program like this. I'm sure there are others that are great that I'm missing. But it is sort of that nexus where you can go from the classroom or from the university and commercialize that technology into a job creator and keep that local, in the local economy and local community, is really powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we have time for just one more. I know in the back you had your hand up. Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of great things here this morning, and I'm sure that our high-level state policymakers would benefit from hearing about these things we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And it'd be wonderful if we could put together a campaign to reach out systematically to them and make sure that they're educated on the kinds of policies that they can put into place to assist all of this.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I know that was sort of, again, we keep talking about the geographic importance that it has to be sort of done locally, and so the only way to do that is to have federal policy, but that is really also has engaged partners at the state and local level as well.
I think Small Business Majority has been great about providing these opportunities.
I was going to go there, and I wasn't going to go there because
I'll do it for you.
I know I've been talking about SBM, but there, we have leads in so many states across the country, and that is really their job, to understand that state and to understand what the needs are in that state for small businesses to have a rallying point kind of in that state for business and for community and for this is what's going on in your state. Oh, this is where the money is being spent in your state. One of these days we're going to hit all 50 states. Right now we're in 8 states, but we're still moving because that's where the real activity is. That's where we're seeing the money going. But as we start to move and as the organization begins to grow, and we'll get that word out there, because that is what's important. It's that kind of grassroots level that is really, that's what gets anything happening though, right? In politics and everything. It is that grassroots level of people understanding what is available to them at that state that moves up, and then it moves up, and then it moves up.
So final comment?
Yeah, if you just indulge me a minute.
Yeah.
Apologies in advance, guys, but we are nearing the end of the administration, and I just want to acknowledge the awesome SSBCI and SBLF program teams that have done incredible work standing up and implementing these programs, and with the reports that came out today. So I just want to say thank you to you all for all the work you've done to support America's small businesses.
Yeah, and thank you all for coming and being on the panel. I think this was such a good group of people. I'm so excited about this panel. And thank you everyone for coming, and thanks for the great questions. All right, thanks.